make sure my sound is working. Okay, good. Keith, you can pull up. Keith and I are going to tag team a little bit here. Go ahead and pull up the presentation, Keith. You know, we'll be brief on the introductions. We've been tasked, as Don said, I think that gives a good summary of what we're tasked with. The real focus has been, you know, water resource planning, and we'll get into that in just a minute. Go to the next slide. The reason why I pull up this next slide, it's interesting. I just have to start off with a little story, and I've studied water resources and been in water resources for well over 20 years. Early in my career, I had a neighbor who also was had studied in the engineering field, and he had just bought a boat, and we were just having a neighborhood chat, and he's like, you know, don't you love this fact that I can just turn my sprinklers on and I just get charged a flat rate, and I could just, you know, I could do whatever I want and I don't get charged. Isn't that wonderful? And I thought, well, maybe for some people. And not even 3 minutes later into the conversation, he talked about the new boat that he bought, and he was unable to dock at Deer Creek at his favorite dock because Deer Creek was so low. And it was kind of shocking to me that he hadn't necessarily made the connection between letting his sprinklers run 24 hours a day and the level of the reservoir at Deer Creek, out of which his irrigation water came from. And so it was shocking because he was supposed to be well informed, well educated, but he had never made the connection. And so I think part of what we're doing here and what Clyde and Snow and Jacobs put together is helping to inform the conversation. I think we need to educate people with real data and real studies and help inform them of how things are connected, how our water is connected to the natural system, how it impacts the economy as well. You know, I've worked in water resources for 20 years, and 15 of those years or so has been working on the Bear River Project, Bear River Development Project. Now, before I make too many enemies right off the bat, it has been a very enlightening process for me as well to understand and work closely with water managers in the planning of water resources, but also to work closely with many of you who've helped educate me on the importance of the natural systems and their connection to water. I think in this introduction, I've also worked for well over 10 years on the hydrologic systems of the Great Salt Lake in one form or another, working closely at times with Compass Minerals as well, and that's also opened my eyes to you know, the beauty of the Great Salt Lake and the importance of it. I don't think the Great Salt Lake needs much of an introduction. I think many of you are passionate about it. One thing I would mention, we all understand it's important, but one thing I've noticed in all the discussions, maybe that's missing a little bit, is that you know, I work a lot for farmers in irrigation water, and their goal is to help feed the world in their production. What's interesting is we look at the Great Salt Lake and its contribution to also feeding the world. We look at the brine shrimp industry that helps to enhance the aquaculture, which helps feed people, and also the hundreds of thousands of tons of fertilizer that comes off of the Great Salt Lake minerals, this process there. Many of it organic and natural form to enhance agricultural food production. That you know, we see the Great Salt Lake giving a lot, and as we look at the system as a cycle, we can all give in our own ways to the system. Many of you enjoy birds, others enjoy just the open space, but what's become clear to me is that the importance of the Great Salt Lake goes beyond economic, but you know, helping to feed and to feed our spirits as well. It's a great place to be. Many of you that have been out there. So before you tag me as the enemy of the Great Salt Lake, because I have worked on the Bear River Project, I think it's done nothing but open up my eyes more towards the importance of it. And I think many of the water managers understand that. So as we jump into this, the title of it's Water Conservation Impact Study. That's a pretty broad title. We've looked much closer at the impacts of water conservation. When we talk water conservation, we're talking municipal industrial water conservation. The impacts of that on water resource planning. In the 10 or 15 years that I've worked on the Bear River project, that was never part of the scope of that initial study that Division of Water Resources put out. And I always felt like it was a key component. So to see this topic come up and that we're able to bring Keith Larson from our office in on this has been a great thing. And Keith has worked well over 20 years on water resource planning and helping water districts understand their supplies and their projected demands, help them get their arms around population numbers. And he's worked parallel with me in this industry. We both for well over 20 years, and it's been fun working with Keith on this project. So just to tie this in briefly with, you see the little house there on the right. Strategy number 5. We do feel like that a lot of the work that we do at looking at conservation requires that those foundational strategies be focused on as well. But I think the overall public view of things, really the strategy number 5 is something that everybody can help on. It's going to be hard for the general public to work on shepherding water. That's a legal issue. It's a policy issue. But number 5 is really a hands-on, and I think that it's great that the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council has chosen to focus on this, and it's been our pleasure to work on this. It's been a fun little study. So the purpose was to look at the impacts on water resource planning, namely large water development projects, and then develop an action plan or list of studies where we could outline prioritized studies we feel like need to happen to help people understand their connection with water, but also the importance of conserving it. Next slide, Keith. I think I'll turn the time over to you after this, but maybe just to point out, being our focus on this, looking at the timing of large water development projects, this is an example of the Bear River Development Project timing. If you'll notice that when we first started talking about the Bear River Project during the Development Act in 1991, it had a projected need of 2015. And even on into 1997, it was still considered to be needed by 2015. And Keith is going to go over some of the details of this, and you'll see why that was anticipated need because of our usage rates and what we projected in terms of population. In 2004, we started to realize it's starting to slip. And by 2010, 2014, we knew it was going to be out towards 2035 is when we needed the Bear River project. And now lately, the state just issued earlier, what was that, late last year, the statement that it's probably not needed until 2045 and 2050, primarily to conservation efforts. And we see that the conservation plays an important role in the timing of these large projects. Because of the expense of the projects, conservation has definitely been a hot topic for a lot of the water districts. So that being the overall purpose, and mostly what Keith is going to review here in a few minutes is how conservation has affected the timing of large projects, but also how it could affect the timing and what needs to be done maybe to affect the timing specifically to push it beyond 2065. So I'll turn the time over to Keith here.
So with that introduction, let me talk about the details of what we did. This is a limited analysis in scope and budget. So we really had to focus on existing data. You're not going to see a lot of new analysis here outside of gathering what's already been there. So we looked at supply and demand data from districts and from the Division of Water Rights water use database, looked at the projected need based on future growth projections, and then looked at the impact of both historic conservation efforts and expected future conservation efforts. Those future efforts are largely based on the Division of Water Resources' recent Regional Conservation Goals program. And so that is something we'll look at and talk about here. And then look at additional conservation required to postpone water development projects beyond our planning window of 2065. We haven't made any attempt to say what happens after that, but we have looked at our projections through 2065 and what that means. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide, and then you're going to see a whole bunch that look exactly like it or similar to it that we can go through a little faster. This is Bear River Water Conservancy District, and this is a comparison of projected demand and supply through 2065, starting in 2015. So what we have is the solid area portion of the graph is supplies, and I've grouped them into culinary and secondary supplies. That information is taken from both their master plan and information collected by the Division of Water Resources. On top of that, we have also included estimates from the division relative to agricultural water conversion from agricultural water to M&I usage. And they include both a high and low estimate, and so that we've included those numbers there as well. On top of those supplies, we have projected demands based on the Kem Gardner Institute population projections. And essentially what we're showing are a couple things. Number one, if you look at the dashed black line here, that is demand based on what 2015 water use was, and that's in this case 318 gallons per capita per day. So basically, if we just took 318, we projected that out based on the Kem Gardner projections, we see what that growth would do. We've also put on a couple other lines here that provide some interest. One is what demand was in 2005. And I hate, we did this alphabetically, but I hate to bring up Bear River first because 2005 water use actually shows a little bit lower at 282. However, we have some questions as to how accurate that data was, and it involved a number of estimates in 2005. So I'm not really sure that use has actually gone up for Bear River, but that is the data that we have there. And you'll see as we look at the other districts that in general, outside of this one, it does appear that we have been achieving some good results through conservation. And then very last is we include what the demand would be if Bear River were to achieve the regional conservation goals. The regional goals are set only through 2030, but there are some estimates of what future goals may be, and so we've gone ahead and put those into the model. And that includes dropping water use to 236 gallons per day by the year 2065. And so you can kind of see where that looks. So if you look at this particular chart, you would conclude that for Bear River, even at current water use levels, we're in pretty good shape out through 2065. And that's based on these Kem Gardner projections. However, yeah, go ahead.
Can I interrupt, Mr. Chair? This is Commissioner Scott. Just a couple of things. I know that this is, as you mentioned, that this is existing data. A couple of things. Tremonton City has started a secondary water system, and so they've actually acquired some Bear River Canal Company shares and are using those for mandatory secondary water throughout the entire municipality. And that should be built out within the next 2 years. So that should alleviate a lot of their culinary use issues. The other thing that we've mentioned to the Gardner Policy Institute, we think that their numbers as far as growth are woefully low. With the building permits that we're seeing right now, we expect the growth rate to be approximately double what they're forecasting, just because of the home prices along the Wasatch Front and the number of new developments we already have in progress.
Yeah, and that's a great lead into this next slide, which is just talking about that difference between what Chem Gardner has and what the district is actually projecting. And so what we did was we went and looked at historic growth. You can see this is, goes out forever, kind of, what would happen in the future. So we looked at historic growth, and if you look at the Chem Gardner projections, they basically plug along at the historic growth out to 2065, and if we just carry them out, they would continue there. However, if you look at the amount of property that's available in the area, you could see populations up to 650,000 at some point, just at current densities, not even increased densities. And so the Water Conservancy District's master plan actually identifies projections that are, as you mentioned, much more aggressive. And you can see, we've extrapolated that out into the future. They are more indicative of what would happen if Box Elder County, in this case, were to develop more like a urban population center, or suburban population center anyway, rather than the type of rural community that it has historically been. So one of the big questions coming out of this study is, what is the future of Box Elder County and perhaps Cache County as well? Does it look like what it has historically, or do those development pressures push it upwards? And so we didn't attempt to answer which of those visions is the case, but we did want to revise our analysis to reflect that higher level of population projection, and that's what's shown here. And so what we see here is we see a different picture if those more aggressive population projections were to occur. In this case, we run out of available supply, around the year 2035 for an aggressive, and 3 or 4 years later, even with the high estimates of ag conversion. At the regional goals, we're okay if we get the high level of ag conversion water estimated, but we actually need to put more conservation in place if we kind of want to guarantee ourselves that we can reach that 2065 without having to develop additional water beyond that. So essentially what we've done here is we've updated that for the population projections as you've indicated, and then we've identified what would need to be the goal to postpone the project beyond 2065. Now, obviously, there's a lot of unknowns or things that could be additionally refined, and we're going to talk about that right at the end of this presentation about the additional things that need to happen. But that's essentially what the analysis then identifies, is where we need to be to put that beyond 2065. Okay, so if that kind of makes sense, any big picture questions on what I've presented thus far? Because I'm now going to jump to the other 3 districts and show these same results for the other districts.
I have a question, Keith. This is Tom Ward. And maybe just you can punt it till later if you're going to address it. In my conversation with district managers, one of the issues to meet these goals is they don't control land use planning. So maybe that's a different meeting, or maybe we're covering it later, but to achieve 220, what land use planning for new development and redevelopment is required. I'll leave it to your discretion where you plug that in.
Yeah, so we're gonna talk about what's required to hit these goals here after we talk about reaching them, and then I think that's a great point that you make. And if I don't cover it, then let's talk about it again. Bring it up again, please.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's go ahead.
Keith,
Yes.
This is Trevor Nelson from Bear River Canal. With your Box Elder projections here, you're holding secondary water as steady through that period. Could you run me through why your secondary water is stagnant?
So I think what your, well, a couple things. First one is these are based on the estimates that come from the current plan identified by the Water Conservancy District. So I have not done a detailed analysis of those secondary supplies, and that is something that we've identified as an area that needs a little more attention to look at into the future. The other thought is that one thing is a lot of this ag conversion water, we suspect that that is going to go into your secondary system, well, into secondary supplies there. And so any ag water that is converted over to secondary is represented in the orange up above and not necessarily the green.
Okay. Because that's what we're seeing on the ground here is our biggest share movements in the last 5 years, and what we project forward is going to be kind of replace in place.
Yes.
As we see housing developments go in, the same acreage that was irrigated with Bear River Canal Company water is now owned by the municipality that operates that area, and then they are putting in secondary systems.
Yeah, absolutely, and that is what is reflected in this ag conversion right there.
Okay, thank you.
I will note that you know, not all ground that gets developed has ag water associated with it right now. In both Cache and Bear River, there's a significant amount of ground that does not have ag water currently irrigating it, and so that kind of goes into some of these projections of ag to M&I conversion. And the other thing I will note, just while we're on this topic, is ag to M&I conversion is another area where we've used the best available data from Water Resources, but everybody understands that there needs to be additional examination to refine those numbers moving forward. Sorry, I'll pause one last time for any other questions, and then. Okay, let's go ahead and talk Cache Water District for a second. We've done the exact same thing with Cache, and again, we have the Chem Gardner projections shown, and things look pretty good. The one thing I will note is that Cache is showing some conservation since 2005 that does push out, you know, just if we looked at, let's just look at the most conservative scenario here, you know, we would have needed additional source in 2050-ish, and we've postponed that 5 years or so just by the conservation we've achieved over the last 10 years. And if you get the regional conservation goals, again, we're pulling ourselves down into available water. So Cache has the same challenge as Box Elder, as what does it end up looking like in the future if we continue to see, again, the more aggressive suburban/urban type growth in this area, then we end up with more aggressive growth curve, which then pushes us to the point where we have to, the regional conservation goal gets us most of the way if we can stay within the high estimate. At the low estimate, we actually need a little more conservation to get down to 184. So I'll pause there just to give you a chance to look at those numbers real briefly. And actually, we're going to summarize it here in just a minute, so I'll keep moving. So the next district alphabetically here is Jordan Valley, and we jump up significantly in size relative to total acre feet being used. Jordan Valley, we don't have the same question of population growth. We have a better understanding on what Salt Lake County will be looking like. And so in this particular case, what we've done is we have included the total supply, and Jordan Valley, the way they do their planning, it is all just grouped, and so we put in that total supply. This does include their estimate of future reductions in supply associated with climate change. And we do show where they have traditionally shown Bear River in the past. And so this one is a really interesting one because of a couple things. Number one, we look at what water use was in 2000, up at 251 gallons per day. Had that continued, we would be to the point where, and this is with, again, with climate change. So this would be a little bit higher now, but we're basically to the point where we would have needed that in the next few years here, 2025. But by pushing the water use down over the last 15 years in their case, we've pushed that out to close to 2040, even beyond that. With regional conservation goals, we can get all the way out to 2060. And with a little more conservation, we could push that outside the planning window if we could get down to 160 gallons per capita per day. Okay, we did have a question on with Jordan Valley if we also eliminated some additional supplies, which included some of their new development supplies, and that ends up just requiring additional demand, or excuse me, additional conservation down to 144 gallons per capita per day.
And maybe I'll jump in really quick, Keith. The reason for that was that those additional supplies that are shown on top hatched were supplies taking water out of the Utah Lake system. And so it was interesting to see it's not only the Bear River project that does take water. We all understand there's many projects that have been taking water from the Great Salt Lake system, but these were projects viewed as maybe possibly just appendages to the Bear River project, and not bad by any means, but just part of the water planning portfolio of Jordan Valley. But it was more of an interesting exercise to look at what type of conservation was required to do no large water development projects for Jordan Valley. And so that pushes us way down to the 144 gallons per capita per day.
That was, yeah, and that was the purpose of that. Weber Basin is a little different from some of the entities in that the way that it was created, it has some pretty strict limitations on how water is used both between potable and secondary. And so what we did here was we looked on the potable side first, and what we found is that we end up needing water even with regional conservation goals out towards the end of the planning window. And these are the potable numbers only. I'm going to show a combined graph here, but just keep in mind that they are showing some need out here. And really, without conservation, it would be all the way up at 2030 on the way potable is set up. When we go to secondary, however, the district is in much better shape. But you can see the secondary situation here, and perhaps of most interest is the combined situation. And I will strongly emphasize that the way they're set up right now, they can't just shift water between the two, but it still seemed an interesting exercise to combine them to see if we could find ways legally to move the water. What does it look like? And in this particular case, again, you can see that in 2005 water use, we actually would have needed that water relatively. I mean, we're showing a need today, actually. But with the conservation that has been achieved, this is being pushed out to 2035. And with regional conservation goals, we can push out beyond the 2065 window without additional conservation beyond the regional goals. Again, emphasizing that, however, with potable, as we looked up above, until you figure out how to get secondary and potable sources to mix, you're still showing a little bit of a need out here at the end. Okay, I'm cognizant of my time, so I'm trying to go through here quick, but a lot of good information to present. So this is just a summary of what has been the impact of conservation on the timing of specifically the Bear River development, but large water development projects. And basically this shows, you know, historic water use. This is when we would have needed it. 2015 water use. This is where we project needing it. If we can get the regional goals, here's where it happens. And if we can hit that with additional conservation that we're calling it, we can push things out beyond 2065. So to Tom's question earlier, here's just a summary of what that means in terms of per capita water use and the percentages of reduction required. This is for the regional goals. This is to get the need for development postponed beyond 2065. And graphically, that looks like this. This is how those numbers change with each of those points.
Now again, maybe we just emphasize with this graph that, you know, we're not tasked right now, nor do we have the data to look beyond the 2065. But I'm sure that many of you are thinking that population won't stop growing after 2065. But this is just looking in the 2065 planning window. Beyond that, then that's for other studies, I guess, or just ongoing planning as we always do.
Yeah. So to Tom's question, what does this mean? What's the required action to achieve these conservation scenarios? Included in the report is a big detailed table. I'm not going to go through all these numbers, but I do want to hit a couple of highlights. So this is for Bear River, this is for Cache, and we'll look at Jordan Valley and Weber Basin here in a moment. But for all of these, I wanted to highlight, all of these basically have the same indoor activities that need to happen. High efficiency faucets and showers estimated at currently about 80%. That needs to get to near 100. We know 100 is probably not likely, but near 100%. High efficiency toilets, 63%. Those need to get to near 100, including 10% at ultra high efficiency. Or that's for the regional goals. Or for the additional conservation, we need to get to close to 75% ultra high efficiency. And all of these, there's some give and take, right? You could do a little bit less in one area and more in another, but this gives you a feel for what needs to happen. High efficiency washing machines, 46 to 100%, and reduction in leaks and other indoor water use, 20% at the regional conservation goal and 50% at the additional conservation level. Here's Jordan Valley and Weber Basin, but let me jump to outdoor as well. So those were all common. Outdoor is a little bit different depending on where you're at. So there's three areas where we're going to need to achieve change in order to reach those goals. One area is our irrigation efficiency. So what we did is we said, what is the best level of expected efficiency? This is from the regional conservation goals. And the assumption was that for sprinklered systems, we can get about 70% efficient, and for drip systems, we can get 80% or more. If we use those numbers, each of these entities are estimated to be at this current level of the best expected. Jordan Valley is 83%, Cache is 70%, etc. So basically what we would expect is that they would need to get from wherever they're at today up to that level of best expected. And so the darker green shows how much improvement that they need to make there. As Tom mentioned, another thing that's going to need to happen is our lot size is going to need to decrease. And so this shows current lot use sizes as of 2015. and what would be needed to achieve the additional conservation. And I've shown a percentage in terms of total lot size reduction. Those are, a lot of those are kind of happening organically. The trends are for smaller household sizes, etc. Or it's not household sizes, but lot sizes, more density. But those are the numbers that would need to be hit by 2065 to achieve those goals. And then lastly, on the outdoor, obviously, we're going to need to do a little bit better in our landscaping. And so I don't have a current breakdown on between the different entities. I just have a total number of estimated for the Wasatch Front. About 70%, just shy of 70% of our landscapes are cool season turf grasses right now that are higher water use. To meet our goals, we would need to move some properties to more efficient, water efficient, more water-wise landscaping options. That could be hardscapes, that could be perennials and shrubs, that could be lower water use turf options. But essentially, for existing properties by 2065, we would need to get the numbers from 70% to the values shown here. And you can see the different districts. For new properties, we're making the assumption that it will be easier to reach those goals for new properties. And so this is the amount of turf grasses that we would need to reach those goals based on the current numbers. Just editorially, there's significant action that is going to need to occur if we are to reach those goals. And I think you can kind of see that there's some significant changes that would need to occur if we're going to make those goals.